Okay, so just as a little starter today, as a little sampler, I want to talk about three specific things in chapters 1 through 5. Now, again, normally I would have the biblical text up and I would highlight words and kind of go through it with you, but I'm a little hamstrung today and I'm sorry about that. So my advice is open up the Bible, open up either online or your printed Bible, and just look at these things and you'll be able to follow, I think, pretty clearly what I'm talking about. Now, the first thing I want you to notice is at the very beginning of the book. It says that after Joshua died, now Joshua was the leader that Moses gave authority to lead Israel into the promised land. And in the book of Joshua, it seems like Israel conquered the whole land and then divided it up and they were all done. But it says at the beginning of Judges that after Joshua died, the Israelites said, who's going to go up now for us and fight against the Canaanites? In fact, despite Joshua's very rosy picture of these events, the fact is that they were not able to defeat all the Canaanites so quickly, and instead the taking over of the land was a much longer, much more complicated process. And the book of Judges does reflect that. That seems to be in the historical background of Judges, which is different from Joshua. So the thing I want you to notice then is that this book is already distancing itself from the happy ending of Joshua. And in fact, this is not a book about happy endings. This is a book about conflict. This is a book about chaos. This is a book about trial, about social breakdown, right? So we're in a difficult moment in this book. Now, the second thing I want you to look at is the story of Deborah. Now, this is in chapter 4. And Deborah is very important. She is probably the most interesting woman character in the Old Testament from the perspective of public leadership, right? She is a prophetess. She is a judge. She is a warrior, a general. And Barak, who is the other general in Israel's army, says, I'm only going to go fight if you lead us, right? She's an amazing warrior. And in the course of chapter 4, she wins a huge battle against the Canaanites. God gives the Canaanites into her hands. This is God blessing Deborah with authority and power and effectiveness. I mean, it's an amazing story. Now, most of the Bible is, the Old Testament at least, is in a more patriarchal mindset, right? Women have particular roles that they play in the family and in the home, and they don't tend to do these kinds of jobs and have these kinds of roles. And in that sense, Deborah is an exception that proves the rule. She's even more unusual in that regard. Her role doesn't mean that the system wasn't patriarchal, just that she was an exception, right? So it's a good opportunity to think about women in the book. And in fact, there's a lot of different kinds of women in the book. You've got Deborah, who is powerful and who is a hero, right? You have, in contrast to her, in chapter 4, another woman named Jael, who is also a hero, but not from that high level of society. She's from a much lower level. She is in her home, right? She is seizing an opportunity given to her to do something very brave and something very effective and very powerful, but from a different point of view. So in a way, Deborah, who is the leader, who is doing amazing things, and then Jael, who is just the regular woman who is now engaging in remarkable things. These are both coming from different points of view, but still hero stories. But you also have like the story of Delilah, right? She is high society, high status like Deborah, but she plays for the other team. She's one of the enemies, right? And then there are women in the book who are I don't want to say minor characters, I almost said it, but they're like women who aren't named, for example. So there's Jephthah's daughter, who is sacrificed by her father in payment of a vow to God. That's a disturbing story in chapter 11. There is the story of the Levite's concubine who is brutally murdered in chapter 19. So you have some women who are like really suffering at the hands of men, suffering at the hands of society, and even in the story aren't even given names, right? That's one side of the spectrum, all the way to Deborah on the other side. It's this huge range of women characters that we will get to experience. So in reading chapter 4, look at the picture of Deborah in chapter 4 and of Jael at the end of chapter 4, and then Deborah's song in chapter 5. And then toward the end of chapter 5, there's like a whole paragraph of verse, like an entire verse about Jael and celebrating her accomplishment. So let's look a little bit at that story of Jael in chapter 4. Now, in the text it says, and you can look at this, it says that after Deborah defeats the Canaanites very vigorously, all of the armies killed. They're all killed, right? Except Sisera, who is the general, slithers off, slinks off, and runs away and is saving himself. Well, he comes across the tent of this woman named Jael. Now, her husband was of a people group who was currently allied with Sisera's people. And so he thought, okay, this woman is an ally potentially. And so Jael goes out and she says to him, my Lord, turn aside and come into my tent. So he goes into her tent, she covers him with a blanket, gives him some milk, and he goes to sleep. All right. Now, while he's sleeping, Jael takes a tent peg and her hammer and hammers the tent peg into his temple until the other end of it comes out of his head and goes into the ground. Now, I want you to take a second to look at those verses because the narrative slows way down. Look how many verbs there are. She took a tent peg, and she took her hammer, and she walked over in order to do this, and she drove her tent peg all the way through till it hit the ground, right? So you have all this extra detail. It's drama. If this were, if we were watching an HBO miniseries of this would be like in slow-mo, or it would be a very dramatic scene, right? The action builds and builds and points, and then it gets to this moment of great climactic sort of just violence in that story. And it is a story of violence. So I want to say a couple of things about the Jael story. One, it is, let's say, a little spicy. Okay, let me tell you what I mean by that. Now, there are a lot of things in Judges that I would say are adult in nature, that are not necessarily suitable for children. In fact, I think if you made a miniseries of Judges and put it on HBO, it would be every bit as violent and have as much sexual content as Game of Thrones does, right? It's the same kind of story in a way. And I'm not going to dwell on that aspect of it in this context, in this, Sunday school context. I'm not going to dwell on it, but I do want to point out there's an interesting literary thing that's happening where Sisera goes into Jael's tent. Now, the verb that's used there for going into her tent that's one of the euphemisms for sex in the Bible. And I think that it's the narrator is creating a kind of sexual tension in the story. And you see this in movies and stuff where there's sort of a tension. It's like, okay, what's the nature of this scene and what's going to happen next, And I think there's this idea that Sisera is imposing himself on Jael, right? Or she is availing herself to him. There's some kind of a promise there for Sisera. Maybe it's very, very kind of ambiguous. But my point is, the verb then that's used for her impaling his temple with the tent peg is also a kind of penetration, if you will. So it's this like sexual tension and a role reversal. So what the story's doing, just this would be much easier in person instead of just on a video. It's hard. I can't read your reactions, right? But this is the last thing I want to say about it. Just to say, the narrator is doing this amazing literary thing where the narrator's building expectations with the use of the language and of this physical action of him going into her tent, and then flipping it, reversing it, so that now she is sending her tent peg into his head, right? So it's this reversal, a kind of, just makes it a really cool story, all right? The second thing I want to say about Jael, and this has to do with the theology, and this is where I will end for today. It's really hot in this car, I don't know if you can tell. This is where I'll end for today. What's the moral of that story? What's the meaning of that story? What's the message of that story? Was she right to do what she did? The story doesn't tell us. There's no, and God told her to do it, and God was happy that she did it. She is praised by Deborah in the next chapter. Clearly, in the narrative, she is seen as a hero figure. But we, in the process of narrative ethics, are invited into the story. And the question that we're asking ourselves is this. In a complicated world, what do you do when all of the options are bad options? How do we evaluate the ethics of a situation when nothing is pure? She could have saved him, spared him, protected him, but he's one of Israel's enemies. But she killed him. When he was under her protection, she was violating the rules of hospitality, which was very serious in those days. So really, either one of those choices was problematic. Neither one was pure. Neither one was clearly right or clearly good. Both of them involve some kind of moral compromise in a way. And so what does that mean for us? Well, I don't think it has an answer, but I think it invites us into the question to be able to say, it's okay to acknowledge that difficult moral choices and difficult ethical situations might arise in which there isn't a clear answer. There isn't a clear yes or no, black and white, pure choice. And when that happens, what do you do? Well, you have to act. Sometimes we can't not act. We have to act, even when every choice involves some kind of moral complication. But what's the outcome? What's the point? God took her actions and the actions of the other characters in this story and used them to further his plan, the fulfillment of his promises to Abraham and to Israel. What does the story teach us? Not again directly, but only indirectly. That when we are living in a complicated world and making hard choices when it's not always clear what we should do, and it is clear that anything we do, there's going to be at least ambiguities and maybe downsides to every choice that we make, we can yet still trust God. That God is able to take our imperfect decisions, our imperfect actions, the ways in which we use our limited power in imperfect ways, and use them to build his kingdom, use them to further his purposes. And that we can be part of that, not because of any power of our own, not because of our ability to make great choices and be the hero of the story, but that by responding as faithfully and thoughtfully and boldly and courageously as we can in that moment, we can trust that God is going to use that for his purposes. And that's very powerful. And if understood in the right context, gives us both confidence and optimism, a sense of power and strength, but also humility, a sense of our own dependence upon God, our sense of our own weakness perfected in God's strength. So thank you so much. Apologize again for the format. Hopefully it was thought-provoking, and I'll hit you up with a more traditional video, hopefully, next week. All right. Thank you so much.